The whole aesthetic of Tate is so much like the bros that Donald Trump loves and who love Donald Trump in America. And these are the people that in the Maga podcast land are the people who are cheering for Donald Trump every day.
Never mind the sort of political prisoners or people, Americans who are being detained by different regimes, of which there will be many in different parts of the world. This is the guy. This is their guy. Andrew Tate. The absolute unbridled, unmitigated misogyny.
Why on earth would the US administration want to ally itself or seem to be the helpers of somebody who faces rape and human trafficking allegations? It makes no sense.
Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the newsagent's live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at the Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th, then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester on February the 24th, and finally the Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of these dates, and the link will be in the description below. We are so excited to see all of you there.
What you're about to hear, I'm sure you will find offensive and disturbing, but I hope you understand why we're playing this.
This is also one of the reasons men find youth attractive. The reason 18 and 19-year-olds are more attractive than 25-year-olds is because they've been through less. It's about the fact that she belongs to him, and the intimate parts of her body belong to him because they're in a relationship. Well, it's been proven that the smartest people in the world are men. Look, read the Bible. Every single man had multiple wives. Not a single woman had multiple husbands. It's against the will of God. It's disgusting. But I said that if a woman is going out with a man, she belongs to that man. That's his woman.
Women aren't as big as me. You're like a 55-kilo female. I will pick you up with one hand, body slam your ass. And when I'm standing on top of you, and you're like, and I'm grabbing you by your neck, and you start annoying me, trying to resist.
That's what happens, Sean. Listen, look at the camera. Why are you getting hit? Why are you getting beaten? She like six. You. Do as I say.
Where the 19-year-old might have had one guy from high school, just broke up, she's fresh, and I could put my imprint on her and make her a good person.
Because in Eastern Europe, none of this garbage flies. If you're going to go to the police and say he raped me back in 1988, they're going to say we should have done something about it then. People say, why did it in Romania? And I explain my 5 reasons. One of them is the Me Too era. They go, oh, well, you're a rapist. I say, no, I'm not a fucking rapist. But I like the idea of being able to just say, to do what I want. I like being free.
Decided to rip your arms from your body and f your girlfriend. Who was right? Every bitch in there knows I cheat.
Most women I know can't even park a car. Why is a woman flying my plane?
Those are the words, the many words of Andrew Tate, the far-right online influencer, quote unquote. A man who since December 2022 has been detained in Romania on charges including human trafficking, rape, and forming an organised crime group to exploit women. Today, he has flown to the United States, released from Romania with the aid and connivance of the Trump administration. There is only one question. Why on earth would the Trump White House try and help a man like that? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
And there is a lot you wake up to these days where you think, blimey, look what's just happened in America. This morning it was, blimey, look what's just happened in Romania, where overnight it was announced that the Tate brothers had had their US passports returned to them and that they were free to fly to America. En route they are right now to Florida. And the president's envoy for special affairs, that is literally his title, Rick Grenell, had met the Romanian foreign minister at the Munich Security Conference a couple of weeks ago and had made the case, release the Tate brothers, let them go. And the Romanians, of course, are not saying we were pressurised into doing it, but join the dots. It seems pretty obvious that what has changed the Romanians' disposition in all of this is the intervention of the Trump administration.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with Tate, you're better off. But just to give you some background about who he is an extremely, extremely influential online influencer, if that's the right word. He and his brother Tristan have been detained in Romania, as I was saying, since December 2022 on charges of human trafficking. their extended detention without trial was primarily due to legal and procedural irregularities. In December 2024, Bucharest court said the trial couldn't go ahead until the prosecution had got its act together, but the charges weren't dropped. And as John said, in the meantime, what has become clear is that various elements of the Trump administration, including, as John said, Richard Grenell, but others as well, have basically been advocating for his release. Alina Haber, political advisor to Trump, has publicly expressed her admiration for Tate. In a podcast appearance, she said, "I agree with everything you say. I have your back out here in the States." Musk as well, Elon Musk, obviously very, very influential, has expressed support for Tate on numerous occasions. In January, he said he supported Tate's bid to become the UK Prime Minister after Tate announced his political party, Britain Restoring Underlying Values, BRUV. See what he did there. Musk responded to a post praising Tate's political involvement by saying he's not wrong. So this is someone who the Trump administration clearly see as a fellow ideological traveller in the culture war that they wish to fight.
And if you just look at Tate, he is so much, the whole aesthetic of Tate is so much like the bros that Donald Trump loves and who love Donald Trump in America. Tight t-shirt, pumped, full of steroids and kind of protein shakes, muscle bound, super macho.
So camp.
It's self-declared misogynists. And these are the people that in the Maga podcast land are the people who are cheering for Donald Trump every day. And it looks like if you cheer for Donald Trump and you've got the right aesthetic, then Donald Trump is going to help you.
That's all it takes.
And that's all it takes. And so even today, as they're flying over, I mean, Robert Jenrick, former Home Office
well-known
minister,
lily-livered liberal,
he has said the Tate brothers stand accused of rape and human trafficking in the UK and must face our justice system. The US now needs to step up. We have an extradition treaty with them and they need to cooperate fully. I think the chances of the Tate brothers being extradited to Britain to face those charges is precisely zero.
Yeah, because we should say we have skin in the game on this because Tate is a British national as well. He's British American national. And indeed he faces charges here.
Yeah,
in addition. And today, I mean, look, I think the chances of him bringing it up are very slim, or probably slim. But, not ideal timing for the Prime Minister, for Keir Starmer, going over to, former Chief Prosecutor, as he often likes to remind us, flying over to Washington on a day where probably one of the most well-known figures of the hard right, far right kind of online ecosystem is being flown over to the United States, basically at the Trump, we can deduce clearly, at the Trump administration's behest and urging, on the day when the Prime Minister is meeting Donald Trump. And then doubtless, I'm sure, one of the reporters at some point will ask about it.
Yes, and I don't know what Keir Starmer says, because Keir Starmer wants to avoid picking fights. Or, let me frame that differently. Keir Starmer wants to be very careful about the fights that he picks. And so getting into a fight over the release of the Tate brothers and them having their passports returned, I would suggest is the last bloody thing in the world that he wants to be discussing with Donald Trump. I mean, Ukraine, NATO, security guarantees, yes. The Tate brothers, no.
Look, I think this reminds us of two things, right, about politics right now. One is, this is something that is getting a lot of attention, but will doubtless just die off very, very quickly, as everything with the flooding the zone Trump administration does, right? It shouldn't be normal, and yet stuff like this, the White House itself actively aiding to get a man like Tate, never mind the sort of political prisoners or Americans who are being detained by different regimes, of which there will be many in different parts of the world. This is the guy. This is their guy. Andrew Tate, a man, as I say, not just wanted for, let's leave aside the alleged criminal elements, we should say, it is alleged, but just the sort of man that he is. You heard the sort of things that were said. I mean, just, it does not take long going through his Twitter or whatever. He says it's things like, it's bang out the machete, boom it in her face, grab her by the neck, shut up, he says in one video. The misogyny, the absolute unbridled, unmitigated misogyny, it actually, words don't even quite sum it up, right? And this This is one of the reasons he's so influential, is that he is corrupting the minds of lots of young men who are finding what he says appealing, who see him online. And he is now being given extra legitimacy by, of all people, the Trump White House. And it reminds us of the second thing that's important about this, which is there is no space to the right that Trump will not go to help and save you if he thinks that you are a fellow traveller in his cause, to his cause, if you are supportive of him for whatever reason. There is no figure too extreme. There is no politician or political figure too toxic. He will help you. And that is why we see exactly the same phenomenon taking place within the core of Maga and within the Maga ecosystem about Tommy Robinson. Jesus, Tommy Robinson is relatively tame in some ways by comparison to this guy. That is why there is just no figure, there is no one-off limits in terms of who is acceptable to Maga and Trump world.
And that is the possibility of what happens today when Stalmer meets Trump, is that someone says, well, what about Tommy Robinson? We know where Elon Musk's found. We think that Elon Musk thinks that Tommy Robinson is a champion of free speech and ought to be released as soon as possible from the brutal, jackboot of British prison system.
Tate might end up in the cabinet for all we know, John. I'm not even joking. I mean, it is not genuine. I mean, I know it sounds ridiculous, but it is not beyond. It won't be the cabinet, because even the Americans, the Republicans in the Senate surely would find a spine about Tate. But, some position within the administration, helping out Doge, who knows? It's all on the table. Nothing's off limits.
Look, we did a live show in Manchester on Monday night, and we had a question and answer session with the audience, and there was a teacher from Liverpool who asked us, I thought, the most difficult question of the evening, when he said, what do I do about the young kids in my class who look at Tate as some kind of role model, who wear their MAGA hats and who think that what he says is okay? It's just got a whole lot more difficult for that teacher now that Tate has been embraced by the Trump administration. Come to America, come to the land of the free, come to the most powerful country in the world. We've got your back.
Well, to try and give us a bit more of an insight into the mind and the world of Andrew Tate, we're joined now by Matt Shea, who's a journalist who has actually made a couple of documentaries about and with Tate, including The Dangerous Rise of Andrew Tate for the BBC. Matt, thanks so much for joining us. One simple question. Are you surprised as to why it is, or are you surprised at the fact that the Trump administration seems so keen to agitate for and on behalf of Tate?
No, not at all. I've been sounding the alarm about the alliance between the Trump administration and the Trump campaign and his inner circle and the Tates for a long time now. Donald Trump Jr. is a friend of Tate's. He said that his detention is absolute insanity. One of Musk's Doge employees appears to be a Tate fan. And recently, when the U.S. Special Envoy Richard Grenell boosted this sort of conspiracy theory that U.S. aid is being used to turn the courts against people who are not considered to be woke in the context of Andrew Tate, I think we began to see that alliance kind of reach its peak. And now you have this very strange scenario where the Trump administration, or officials in the Trump administration, are calling for judicial control to be changed over someone who's accused of very serious human trafficking and rape allegations, which both Tate brothers deny.
Well, that was the obvious question. Why on earth would the US administration want to ally itself, or seem to be the helpers of, somebody who faces rape and human trafficking allegations? It makes no sense.
In Trump's world, it actually makes a lot of sense. So on the one hand, Andrew Tate and Tristan Tate, by sort of radicalizing an entire generation of young men towards the far right, could be credited with helping to get Donald Trump elected. This could be his administration's quid pro quo of saying thank you for that. That's something that Tristan Tate himself, Andrew Tate's brother, has he's said that we helped get Trump elected. On the other hand, by promoting this idea that, there's this term, the Tates call it lawfare, which is a portmanteau of law and warfare. And it's essentially this idea that the courts can be weaponized to go after people who don't agree with their so-called woke agenda. It's a conspiracy theory, right? And that conspiracy theory has been promoted by the Trump administration, especially in the context of Tate. Now, presumably, that's appealing to Trump and his inner circle, many of whom are themselves accused of very serious sexual crimes. But the ludicrousness of it all is that the Trump administration is not saying anything about the dozens of alleged victims of trafficking, of rape, many of whom that the Romanian authorities accuse the Tates of physically raping, of abusing. These are allegations that the Tate brothers deny. But those alleged victims are not a part of the story for the Trump administration. The Trump administration is just saying, these guys are going against the woke agenda. They're being targeted by the judicial system in Romania. Let's help them out.
So what you're saying, Matt, is that it, for them, is part of feeding the persecution narrative that they've developed about their own politics, and also as a means of basically saying, look, this guy is on our side in this kind of civilizational struggle in the way that they see politics.
Absolutely. And it's also, it's priming people for what could be the next step in that persecution politics, because we've already had the administration criticize the Romanian courts for canceling the election in which the far-right candidate, who was backed by Russia, the election was canceled due to alleged interference by Russia. J.D. Vance came to Europe and criticized the Romanian courts for this. Now, this supporting Andrew Tate and delegitimizing the Romanian courts, it will help further if they then support this far-right candidate in the rerun elections, because it just further serves to delegitimize the Romanian courts.
So where does this end? Starmer is in Washington today. Is he going to be under pressure from the Trump administration to say, you, Britain, ought to drop your charges against Andrew Tate?
I mean, this is totally new territory. It's very difficult to see where it goes, but it's obviously incredibly unusual for the American administration to use its influence in this way, because as you brought up, once the trial in Romania concludes on the Tate brothers and their prison sentence, if they're found guilty, concludes, he will then have to be extradited to the UK for charges of sexual misconduct in the UK. So that extradition treaty is still there. The judicial control is still there. If you take this at face value, all it really means is that the Tate brothers are allowed to travel to the US, but if they're summoned back to face trial in Romania, they must immediately go back, if you take that at face value. Now, what we have to watch for is, first of all, if the Tates refuse to go back to Romania to stand trial, will the U.S. allow them to be extradited under the Trump administration? That's the first thing to watch for. The second thing to watch for is he going to meet Donald Trump? Is he going to meet someone from the Trump administration who may see an alliance with Tate as a kind of boost, as a kind of middle finger to the media and to the courts? We'll have to wait and see.
Matt, thank you so much for your insight. Really appreciate it.
I mean, so fascinating. You can be sure that whatever happens now, the Tate brothers will be on a victory lap and being proclaimed by huge numbers of, their influencer supporters in America when they get there.
We'll be back discussing another idea which has become strangely very normal of late, right after this.
I would say that Rishi Sunak is as English as Tizer and Wyferns, right? He is absolutely English. He was born and bred here. And I wouldn't say that the colour of his skin makes him any
He's
less.
a brown Hindu. How is he English?
Because he's born and bred here.
So by being born here, you become English, in your opinion?
Yeah.
That was Konstantin Kissin speaking to the former editor of The Spectator, Fraser Nelson, who writes a column now for the Times newspaper, talking about what it is to be English. And Fraser Nelson, in his Scottish accent, says, look, if you're born here, you qualify. And Konstantin Kissin, who is originally from Russia and is the host of a right-wing podcast called Trigonometry, clearly thinks you aren't. And it has sparked a debate into which Suella Braverman has dived in.
Yeah, Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, of course, fresh from her speech to Washington, D.C., where she, among other things, said that J.D. Vance's idea that Britain might be an Islamist state with nuclear weapons within 20 years was an idea worth talking about, has written a piece in the Telegraph where she backed up the line of questioning that the trigonometry hosts, which gives you a sense of kind of what they're about, the trigonometry hosts were talking about, because she has said herself that she says that she is not truly English. She said, I was born here, raised speaking the Queen's English, educated in England, yet I am not English. My parents, members of the Indian diaspora, were born in Kenya and Mauritius. They acquired British citizenship, but they were not and could never be considered English. For Englishness to mean something substantial, it must be rooted in ancestry, heritage, and yes, ethnicity, not just residence or fluency. I am British Asian. I feel a deep sense of love, gratitude, and loyalty to this country, but I cannot claim to be English, nor should I. This is not exclusionary, it is honest. And it's a really interesting, I mean, we followed that exchange with Fraser Nelson and the trigonometry host at the time, thought about talking about it, but really wanted to get into it today because not only is it an interesting discussion in and of itself about what Englishness means and is, but also it illuminates something that's really important, which is, for my money, how pretty, again, going back to what we were discussing in the first half, how quite radical, once fringe views on what used to be considered the extreme right or hard right have become absolutely mainstream, or at the very least detoxified within British politics. The Overton window again has shifted.
Yeah, so with Suella Braverman, I just don't follow it, to be honest. That she says that she could only be British Asian. Well, okay, Suella, let me ask you a question. Am I English? I mean, my family came from Poland in the 19th century, escaping the pogroms. My dad and mum were born in the UK. I think I'm as English as they come, but maybe I don't. Maybe you have to go back to the Huguenots, or maybe you go back even further. When do you actually qualify?
Norman conquest, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Or French.
Exactly. And so the idea that there is this kind of moment where you suddenly pass an Englishness test, but after that you don't, I just think is completely fallacious. I owe my loyalty, I owe everything to this country where I have grown up. And we have multiple identities, don't we? I was last night at Tottenham Hotspur watching us lose against Manchester City. I'm a Tottenham supporter. When England are playing, I'm an England supporter. When it's the Olympic Games, I support Great Britain.
Did your parents consider themselves English?
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. My dad enrolled in 1939 in the Second World War. Was he a Jewish Briton? Or was he British? He was British.
What Suella Braverman is doing that thing that some people do, which is to say, look, you can be British, that Britishness is a civic construct, and anyone can be British. You can get British citizenship and become British. But that Englishness is an ethnic construct, that it's about blood and soil, basically. But the complicated, and that is one version of ethnicity. So what she is saying, and what the trigonometry host was saying, is that yes, by nationality he is British, but if you're referring to his ethnic background, his heritage is Indian, or in Suella Braverman's case, Mauritian, and therefore his parents were of Indian descent, and therefore he cannot be English. I think the complexity with that, I mean, there's lots of complexities with that. But first of all, I think this is something peculiarly English that we have a problem with. No one doubts for a moment that Humza Yousaf is Scottish. It would be a deeply fringe view within the politics of Scotland right now to say that Humza Yousaf was British but not Scottish. He was literally Scotland's first minister. He would describe himself, I know this, interviewing him many times, as a very, very proud Scot. There has been, actually one of the achievements of Scottish nationalism, and the SNP, to their credit, has been where one of the reasons it was once fringe is that it was basically about a sort of ethnic Scottishness. It was about a kind of white and even Protestant Scottishness, right? It's one of the reasons they were called the Tartan Tories. In Alex Salmond's period of leader of the SNP, he opened it up to Catholic Scots and increasingly to non-white Scots. So they have been quite successful, the SNP, and Scotland more generally, in constructing a vision of Scottishness which is not ethnically based, but based comprehensively on civic virtues and civic attributes. And I do not understand it. I think it has been a problem. I think one of the problems with Englishness as an identity is because it so often gets elided with Britishness, that very often progressive English people feel squeamish and difficult about talking about Englishness and saying that it is an inclusive identity for black, Asian, white alike. And it is left to, I think, and it means that sort of quite hard right elements end up basically describing it and using it to say, yes, you can be British, but you can't be English, which is nonsense.
Well, I think a lot of this arises from the constitutional settlement that came with devolution, where Scotland would have its own parliament, Wales would have its own assembly, Stormont would take back control, but there was no English parliament. The kind of Tam Dalyell West Lothian question of, well, hang on, so can English MPs vote on Scottish affairs? Well, no, but what about English affairs? And, that kind of whole question of who should have the right to vote on English matters, all MPs, but we don't have the right to vote on Scottish matters. And that brought up this kind of sense of what is Englishness? And, it's sort of, is it about foaming pints of ale? Is it about tweed jackets and Barber, wax cotton jackets? I mean, look, I lived in the countryside for a long time in Hampshire. I didn't feel particularly that because I'm an urban rat. I grew up in London and London feels like home. But, defining Englishness as being that thing from the countryside just doesn't seem to me to be realistic. There are all sorts of identities within England as well.
Is David Lammy, our Foreign Secretary, not English? If we look at the England football team, I mean, you help me out here, John, but is, Saka not English? Or help me out here.
Oh, come on. I'm just, it's kind of fun to watch you swing here. No, you're right. And you look at the racism that came.
Was Ian Wright not English? There you go.
There you are, very good. That was going back a few years.
but actually the England football team, and we've talked about this before, but the England football team is a really good example of, and particularly in the Southgate period, it is a very rare thing, the England football. This is one of the problems that we've got. There are so few English cultural or political institutions, distinctly English, in a way that there are very distinctly political institutions which are Scottish or Welsh or whatever. And so the England football team is one of the few cultural institutions or political institutions, because it is a political institution, which is English and which can project a different vision of Englishness. There is no doubt when that very multi-ethnic team is assembled wearing the England white shirt, no one is sat there. It would only be a fringe opinion for anyone to be sat there going, well, half of those lads aren't English. But that is what Suella Braverman is articulating, absurdly. That is what these trigonometry podcast hosts are observing absurdly and positing. And I think what it is reflective of, again, and we keep coming back to this discussion, it is reflective of how extreme the discourse on the right of British politics and the online right of British politics has become. Most people in the country at large would not look, as I say, at the England football team, at any of the lads on there who are not white and go, well, they're not really English. That is not a thought that most people, it would occur to them. They have Birmingham accents or Northern accents or London accents or whatever it happens to be, the born here, raised here, whatever. That is, for most people, enough to be considered English. The blood and soil version of nationalism and ethnicity, which is a largely 19th century concept. Ethnicity itself is a social construct. I'm half Irish. Am I English or am I Irish? I mean, what is it? These are largely social constructs. And if you have people who are brought up here, born here, have the same cultural values, more or less, as the rest of the country, why would you not describe them as English unless you had quite a warped, quite twisted, very 19th century view of what race, ethnicity and politics is?
You see, I think that the blood and soil Englishness that you describe, which is kind of I associate with the real far extreme right, who would kind of march on the cenotaph and fight with police, or who were there, in Southport after the terrible killings of those 3 girls. Why does Suella Braverman think, well, this is proper Englishness and she is not? Why are we erecting barriers that separate us when we're all, I think of Suella Braverman as English.
But I think it goes back to that discussion we were having at the top, John, which is there is a It is part of, it's not the whole part of it, in some ways it's a minor part, but it's a sort of subplot, subtext in the wider way in which the right has become frenzied. There is a sort of narrative on the right at the moment, which is that Western civilization is sort of under attack, that it's about to collapse, that it's one step away from a collapse. Now, that is a narrative that the far right has always had, and they have always posited since time immemorial. You go back to the 30s, you go back before that, since time immemorial, that kind of apocalyptic view that Western civilization, Judeo-Christian civilization now, as Suella Braverman talks about all the time, is about to collapse. That view, always held by the far right, has become mainstream. And it is about an otherness, right? It is about separating.
Exactly.
It is about separating and creating an enemy within. And a sense that some people, and what's sad is that Suella Braverman is doing this to herself. You know, she's internalizing this extreme ideology and this extreme view of what ethnicity, nationhood and nationalism is, and subjecting it and turning it on herself. For what reason, I am not entirely sure. But she is doing that, and it is, as I say, it's part of that narrative which exists on the hard right, which is to suggest that there is a sort of apocalypse just around the corner. And it's deeply, and the fact that has become mainstream. I mean, Kemi Badenoch has literally started putting out conservative campaign literature describing the Conservative Party uniquely as the guardian of Western civilization. Keir Starmer was taking the piss out of her for it in the House of Commons yesterday. But it's all part of this weird apocalyptic view that they've started to develop.
Look, there are real issues that Suella Braverman raises where I probably agree with her 100%. I think it is important that people who come to live here learn the language, are able to function as, you know, it may take a generation of a kind of, your grandma may struggle to learn the English language, but you want to bring up the children and the grandchildren so that they are fully integrated into British life and take part in, you know, British values, and that they accept British values. Because if you have come to this country, as my family did in the 19th century, you are grateful to be alive and to be in that country, and you owe it to king and country, as my father felt in 1939 when he signed up. Because this is where your country is, this is your home, this is who you will fight and die for. I agree with her that people need to integrate into some of the values of Britain. But erecting false barriers that separate and mean that you just look at different tribes within the UK where some are somehow lesser or to be feared more than others, I think is deeply damaging.
What the people who hold this view would say, if they were sat here, is they would put it to us and say, well, John, if you moved to Japan or you moved to Pakistan, would you at some point say and declare that you had ethnically become, or you had become, Japanese or Pakistani? That's the challenge that they would put to us. And my response to that would be to say, well, it depends what you mean. I mean, do you mean that I have become Japanese in the sense that I have Japanese parents who were Japanese, or great-grandparents who were Japanese, or whatever it happens to be? Well, no, clearly not. But also what they do in saying that is positing societies which are very different from ours. They're homogenous, and they have, some of these societies, they do have internally within them quite nationalistic and ethnically based views of what ethnicity or what it means to be part of that nation is. We don't have that. This is where the point of contestation comes. I don't think you think, I think most reasonable people in this country wouldn't think that that is what we want Englishness or Britishness or Welshness or Scottishness to be about. That actually where your parents came from, or where your grandparents came from, or where your great-great-great-grandparents came from is largely immaterial, so long as you subscribe to, and inevitably if you are brought up, as someone like Rishi Sunak is, in the mores and culture of that society. How can they be anything other than English or British? I mean, the absurdity of this conversation, right? Rishi Sunak, a man with vocal cords made of tweed. You know, the guy went to Winchester, for goodness sake, an English public school, born and brought up here. Everything about him, from his clipped accent to his quite restrained manner and all of this sort of, it's awkward, everything about him screams Englishness. And look, it's for him to say, in one sense, look, this is a free country. I mean, that's one of the great things about Britain. You can call yourself what you want. If Suella Braverman says that she doesn't feel English, that's fine. That's up to her. But for others to question, and this is where I think it becomes problematic and so deeply illiberal, for others, including those podcast hosts, to sit there and posit that Sunak can't possibly be English, basically because of his ethnicity. And it was very revealing when they said he's a Hindu. Again, as if that means you're a Hindu, but somehow you can't be English. This is extreme stuff. Again, this is what we need to keep coming back to. This is extreme stuff. It doesn't feel extreme right now because the online discourse has normalised it. But this is stuff that was once confined to the extreme, which is now mainstream. And once again, Suella Braverman is doing her best to normalise it.
Yeah, look, there was the whole thing about Sunak during the election not coming back for D-Day, and Nigel Farage saying something along the lines, well, he's not from our culture.
Yes, and and this is crucial, because when Farage is asked about it, he sort of suggests, and this is what the right do, he sort of suggests that he doesn't have a sort of shared same historical memory or shared historical attachment, despite the fact, of course, how many bloody Indians served in the British Army during the First and Second World Wars, because they were part of the empire, but they always leave that to one side.
Exactly. And so, going back to your question about would I feel Pakistani or would I feel Japanese, I don't know. I haven't gone there. But I know that literally millions of Jews fled Eastern Europe in the end of the 19th century, Russia, Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, you name it, all those places. And then in the 20th century, Austria, Germany, to flee Nazi Germany. And they have been taken in Britain, America, Latin America, Canada, France, Italy, you name it. They've all there are Jewish communities there that probably 150 years ago were somewhere else. And they would describe themselves as Italian or French or American or Canadian or British.
I mean,
and it's not a problem.
Using their logic, as you say, they would be saying to you that you're not English.
Yeah, I think it's ridiculous. I don't know what else I am.
But how does that make you feel?
I just think it's stupid. I think it's absolutely stupid.
Because that's something that's always been attached to Jews in particular, of course.
Yeah.
Is that's the otherness of not being able to truly assimilate, that you're not truly sort of part of this society. You can't ethnically be part of this society because your ethnicity as well as your religion is Jewish.
I think it's absurd. I think that you can practice your religion, stay true to your religious faith. You can be as English as they come.
That's what I'd like to say to Suella Braverman, someone who has appointed herself as someone who's.
I'd love to get Suella Braverman in to talk about this because I think it's fascinating, and I just think it's kind of deeply troubling what she's saying and the argument she's making, because it legitimises so much that is really, really corrosive and bad in our society.
But she was the one who appointed herself as a guardian of things that were offensive to Jewish people during the riots and the marches and all of that sort of stuff. She was very much out there. She said she's a friend of British Jewry and so on. I'd like to hear from her whether she would accept that the logic of what she's saying is that many British Jews
are not really British.
Well, I think she'd say they were British, but they're not English. And because they can't be. I think the last word on this should probably go to, it reminded me of something a few years ago when David Lammy was, he's gone down in the world, of course, now he's Foreign Secretary. He used to be a presenter on LBC, of course. And
he would refer to that as the giddiest height of his CV.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. And he actually, I think, this had come up in one form or another, as it does from time to time, albeit, as I say, it's become much more normalised now. And I think he had a caller who basically said exactly that to him, which is that he was British, but not English. And I think he summed up the reaction very well. This is what he said.
But you will never be English. You are African Caribbean.
But why will I never be English?
Because you're African Caribbean. Look, I can't say to you.
What about my kids? What are my kids? What are my kids?
I can't say I'm African Caribbean.
What? Yeah, but the truth is, Jean, just a little bit of history on this. Britain, 400 years ago, started going out into the world. It colonised and conquered a lot of the world. A lot of the world has ended up coming back to the mother country. My parents were part of that generation who came from the Caribbean. When I took a DNA test, I actually had Scottish in me, probably because as a result of that, someone somewhere, frankly, got their leg over with one of my ancestors, and I've got Scottish blood running through me. I said that gently, but it could have been horrendous. Let's be clear about that. And here I am, having grown up in this country, have been born of this country, and actually, the truth is, it's a myth that there's one English ethnicity. There's not, because England has always been a country in which Huguenots, Danes, all sorts of people have passed through. So when you say you are English, I'm not saying that doesn't mean something to you and matter hugely.
It does.
Because there are probably, as you put it, years and years, hundreds of years of experience of that. But it is to say that for me, the fact that I was born here and the fact that my sensibilities are English mean that I want to claim that heritage as well.
We will be back just after this.
It is 2:30 in the afternoon here in London as we sit here recording, 9:30 in Washington, D.C. At around 12:15, Keir Starmer arrives at the White House. There'll be something in the Oval Office, undoubtedly, and then there's meant to be a news conference between Trump and Starmer later on, and we'll be reflecting that with an episode of the podcast that we'll have in your feeds, hopefully by tomorrow lunchtime.
It's a bit of fly on the wall.
Oh, my word.
Oh.
The lunch bit will be interesting. The handshakes, the body language. I just can't see. It's you look at Macron, there were kind of hands everywhere and touches and hugs. They were. I mean, honestly, there were times when you thought, oh my God, the pair of you. And
put it away, lads.
And you can't see Mr. Buttoned Up Starmer kind of being very comfortable with all of that.
I mean, it is a moment of maximum peril. And the best, and definitely one of the biggest moments, if not arguably the biggest one since he became Prime Minister. He's got so much to try and get out of it, so much of a relationship to try and establish, but also every single second which goes by has the potential for combustibility, for volatility, and he will have to judge every single second how he reacts to every little thing that comes out of Trump's mouth. It doesn't feel, by the time you're listening to this, you'll know we don't right now, it doesn't feel as if it's going to pass off without incident. I think I'm willing to say that.
Nothing passes off without incident.
Except there was one thing, right, just before we go. Did you see the interview between Sean Hannity, Fox News presenter, and Musk and Trump? Two of literally, they commit news every single time they open their mouth. I think they had them for like half an hour, 40 minutes. Not a single news line from Sean. How do you have two news machines? It's actually an achievement to have two massive news machines and not one piece of news committee, because he was so soft-soaped with them.
Because you asked the most boring
Exactly.
questions.
Why do you both love each other so much?
How much do you really respect each other? Huge amounts. Do you really get on that? Well, we get on fantastically.
Sean, you're pathetic.
Bye. See you tomorrow.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.